I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think this is my 12th run at Homelessness Week in various roles over time, and I think it is really important to acknowledge in Homelessness Week that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first people in this country to really understand the devastating consequences of homelessness, both individually and collectively for clan nations. And we know that while we're a city-state and while we don't get remote housing funding in the Territory, there is a significant gap in urgent need of closing between housing outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Canberrans and the rest of us. And I think one of the damning stats for me that I can't get out of my head is that a 5-year-old AHURI girl is 14 times more likely to be able to tell you what the inside of a homelessness service looks like by her 5th birthday than her non-Aboriginal classmate. And so I really would encourage everyone in this room and decision makers in this town to do everything that we can to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to close that gap. Welcome everybody to this Homelessness Week research launch event. I'd just like to acknowledge Minister Bassarotti and Shadow Minister Parton, and also Tom Rosser from Minister Berry's office, and Nicole Porter, who is joining us online. And start by acknowledging that while this is an ACT shelter and AHURI event, this research would not have been made possible, firstly, if not for the role of Andrew Rowe in his role as ACT shelter chair, who sat down with me and said, what sort of questions should we be asking to demonstrate the kind of economic and social return on investment that you would get from scaling up investment in social and affordable housing, and who might we engage to do that? And I thought, well, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute is ideally placed to support us to do that. And then it became a question of dollars. ACT Shelter has a pretty modest budget, and I hadn't actually thought in the past about reaching out to our members, but I was very pleased to see that immediately after doing so, we were able to get a dozen of our member and partner peak and provider organisations on board to co-fund the research, and I'll just name them because I think it's important. ACTCOS, Anglicare, ACT, Argyle Housing, Catholic Care, Merrymead, Canberra Golden, CHC Australia, Havelock Housing Association, St Vincent de Paul Society, Woden Community Service, the Women's Centre for Health Matters, the Youth Coalition of the ACT and YWCA Canberra. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Prime Minister's COVID stimulus, because it was actually the cash flow boost, the rebate on the BAS, that enabled ACT Shelter to have some spare funds to contribute to this research. So I'd like to thank the Commonwealth for its de facto funding of this important research. And why Homelessness Week? Well, I think, as I said before, it's my 12th Homelessness Week playing some sort of a role. And over time, I think I started out in the homelessness sector in 2004 in youth refuges in Adelaide. And over that 17-year period, I've seen more and more coalescence around a single advocacy point, and that is that ultimately to end homelessness, it takes an affordable, safe and secure home. And so we can support people in crisis with non-accommodation supports, and that's important. But I think reflected in the Homelessness Week theme this year, Everybody Needs a Home, I was really pleased to catch up with Kate Colvin, the spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign, at the start of the week, and sort of talk her through some of the key findings from this research. And perhaps not amazingly, it really backed some other research that campaign launched earlier this week, which really showed the high cost of the private rental market is taking a lot of the take-home pay of frontline workers in social services, of retail and hospitality workers, of a whole range of people in the first income quintile in the ACT, which goes up to about a graduate's salary of 50 grand, and even up into the middle of quintile 2. And I was quite shocked to see that in the inner north and the inner south, frontline support workers in homelessness and other community services are spending 2/3 of their income on rent alone. And so I think, importantly, there's other research that's been done by the ACT government. We've seen the cohort study a couple of years ago that really showed that for a small number of people, or a smaller percentage of people, in our homelessness services and accessing other support services, we really do need to look at permanent supportive housing solutions for that group, and that there is a significant social and economic return on investment individually and territory-wide for doing so. So I guess we asked AHURI to do this research, firstly to sort of quantify the level of unmet need for social housing, so that's housing managed either by Housing ACT or community housing providers that is let at non-market rent, so proportionate to somebody's income. That's really important in a city where the median rent for a one-bedroom flat certainly exceeds the age pension and the New Start allowance and leaves other people with very little to live on. We found that we need 3,100 properties immediately just to meet demand by the people that we know are experiencing homelessness and to get that social housing waiting list down. And we know that if we go up a little bit higher into the middle of quintile 2, and this is very economic language, but it's somebody earning up to about 75 grand. So we see that the housing need is closer to 6,000 properties, the gap between demand and supply of affordable rental properties. And I think importantly, what we have seen in some research also released earlier this week, the cost of spending far too much money and more money than you can afford on rent is not just felt by individual households, but it has broader effects across the economy. It means there's less disposable income that those households have to spend on other sectors of the economy. And from the Chief Minister's perspective, I guess that means the economic diversification, that goal, along with the social inclusion goal, both of those goals are hampered, or the achievement of them is hampered when people are spending far more than they can afford on rent. And so we wanted to understand through this research what are the social and economic implications of homelessness and also of far too many people paying more than they can afford in rent. And we found several years ago, when we were funded in our housing and homelessness research consortium with ACT Cost, the Women's Centre for Health and Youth Co, that people at that time were making significant compromises just to make rent. So they would take their children to the doctor, but they would not go to the GP themselves. They would compromise on other health expenses. They would compromise on the quality of their food. They would forego a week's holiday to see relatives and family interstate. And so we wanted to understand the implications for the economy as well as the significant social damage that really not being able to participate fully in the life of this city that is the result of the high cost of the private rental market can create for people. And before I hand over to the researchers, I'd also like to thank, in addition to those funding partners, the services and community housing providers who found guests of homelessness services and tenants of community housing providers for the comparison control that you can read about in report number 2 that looked at the cost of servicing people in a state of homelessness in high-cost centres like Justice, the adult mental health unit, and very high-cost crisis settings versus the service interactions that people have when they're securely housed in a community housing tenancy. And I think you'll find the report findings quite enlightening in that regard, because they actually do back research commissioned elsewhere by the Centre for Social Impact in WA and Cameron Parcell in Queensland, who have found that it is actually, for a number of people, significantly more expensive across other government portfolio areas to maintain people in a state of homelessness, while further and further damage is done because that homelessness is not resolved. And before I hand over to the research team, who will speak after me before we have a Q&A session, I'd just like to plug AHURI. It was a really productive client engagement with AHURI from my perspective. In the midst of a pandemic, when their hometown was locked down for a significant period of time, they were very accommodating of our needs and very willing to adjust the settings of the research as needed based on what was happening here on the ground. So I'll now hand over to the research team, but just say to anyone online or in the room, if you are looking for housing or homelessness research to be done, AHURI Professional Services I can highly recommend. Thanks.
Thanks, Travis, for that introduction. That was very generous of you, and we've certainly greatly enjoyed working with you and your members and colleagues at ACT Shelter. And we really are, I guess, are very appreciative of the opportunity to be able to conduct this research for this project on your behalf. It's been very interesting for us as well. So I'm Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI. And
and I am Dr. Nicola Brackerz, and I am the Senior Manager of Research at AHURI Professional Services. Is that even right? That's not even right. Anyway, I was a key contributor to this research, and I would also like to introduce Jim Davison, who's unfortunately not able to be with us today, who was absolutely instrumental to undertaking the economic analysis for this report, and we're incredibly grateful to his contribution to this.
So I'm Tom Alves, and Nicola Brackerz. Nicola's acknowledged Jim Davison, who was so instrumental in doing a lot of the work on this report. At AHURI, for more than 20 years, obviously, we've been running housing and homelessness research on behalf of all of Australia's governments, state, territory and Commonwealth, and for the benefit of all Australians. And this means we have quite a large evidence base about housing and homelessness in Australia. And I just want to highlight a couple of key pieces of evidence that we've been building over those years. As a way of, I guess, introducing the project for ACT Shelter, which was really about taking this work and this evidence and applying it and analysing it very specifically and deliberately within the ACT context. Firstly, we've regularly conducted research, and Kath Hulse frequently has led this, looking at the affordability and availability of rental housing in Australia. And just with this one chart, I think it's pretty obvious here that rental affordability in Australia at the national level has been in significant decline over the years and has reached something of a crisis point. We've also regularly looked at the state of homelessness across the country, and this most recent version of this investigation, led by Parkinson in 2019, again looks at how homelessness has been tracking in between the last couple of censuses. And you can see there, obviously, rough sleeping and overcrowding are the two particular types of homelessness that have been growing at a somewhat alarming rate. One of the key findings from that Parkinson study is that there's a very strong relationship between the supply of affordable rental housing in a particular location and the rate of homelessness in that same location. I guess normally it's a lack of affordable rental housing there. So that was something else then that we were keen to investigate further and explore in the ACT context. We've also conducted research looking at the extent of housing need. Again, this is a national study which Lawson led in 2018. And from is there, really just the bottom line is the one you need to notice, where at 2016, at the time of the last census, we already had a significant shortfall of affordable housing to the tune of 433,400 properties. That's about addressing manifest housing need in terms of homelessness, but also the fact, acknowledging the fact that many are in significant rental stress and very much at risk of homelessness as well. But then projecting forward 20 years to 2036, the growth of homelessness and the decline of rental affordability that I showed you a moment ago mean that we obviously don't just need to address the pre-existing need, we also need to plan to address need that will be emerging. And so the figure of 727,500 properties required nationally by 2036 is where that study landed. And we've also engaged in research that looks at what the cost of some of this type of provision would be. And Zaretsky and Flatow study, which is getting a bit old now, in 2013, looked at these costs and offset those against the benefit that comes in terms of savings, so the avoided costs of housing people who would otherwise be homeless, to come up with, I guess, the net cost of the provision of housing for homeless Australians. So all of these are national studies, and when Travis first approached us and Andrew, really the question, the underlying question was, okay, this is all interesting, it's all very well, but what does this mean for the ACT? What does this mean for Canberra? Is the ACT a special case? Is it different to the rest of Australia, perhaps? Or will we find the same sorts of things also pertain in the ACT? And then taking those methods and approaches of those national studies and the work that we've been doing for more than 20 years in that space, what does this actually mean in the ACT context? What are the costs and the benefits of providing housing there? What will it cost to provide housing in the ACT? And I guess ultimately the final question there, what is that return on investment in the ACT specifically? And so the way we approached this was in two stages, and each stage produced a report, which I'm sure is available there. I understand there are some copies that Travis has had printed to be available there today. Also, if not, both the reports can be accessed through the AHURI website, and I've passed on that link to Travis, so I'm sure he can distribute that to you. But anyway, the first stage of the research looked at, I guess, scoping the nature of the issue and establishing a bit of a baseline. So what is the actual extent of housing need in the ACT? What are the potential cost savings or benefits as well that would arise from adequately and securely housing people in the ACT who currently lack adequate secure housing? And then what are the options, and what are some of the issues in achieving those options? And that's laid out in that first report. And then the second stage of our approach was having established all of that, to then look at what are specifically the costs of developing and operating social housing in the ACT. What are the cost benefits of that provision? in terms of getting people who aren't housed currently into housing, and then crunching those numbers to determine the return on that investment. And that's how we conducted that, and what we found is contained in that second report there, which again, there may be some copies in the room, and is also now published on the AHURI website. In order to do this second piece of work, we conducted a range of surveys, and we thank again the participants in those surveys and the organisations that helped to facilitate that, a number of whom I'm sure are present. So thank you. We surveyed people who were currently housed, and we also surveyed people who were homeless, and we also surveyed people who provide housing in the community housing sector. And before I hand over to Nicola to take you through some of the finer grain of the findings of this piece of work, just to, I guess, jump straight to the end, what are the headline findings? Well, what we did discover is that that initial question we had, well, is the ACT unusual, or does it stand out in any particular way from the rest of Australia? Well, it does in some ways, but fundamentally, though, the housing need that is present, and the costs and the benefits of providing housing in the ACT are pretty comparable to other parts of the country. We saw that community housing has a particular and very complementary role to play to public housing in addressing housing need, and again, cutting to the chase in terms of that, the return on investment, the benefit cost ratio that we were able to identify, and Nicola will go into this a little bit more, it is and part of the issue in terms of the depth and the sensitivity of the data that we were able to put into our modelling was such that what we can say is that there's a range, I guess, of benefit of that benefit cost ratio. So for every dollar spent on housing, there's at least a 30-cent return, and in some instances, there's also a higher return heading towards 60 cents in the dollar. So I'll now hand over to Nicola to give you a bit more detail.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I thought let's start off by going right back to basics, and I won't spend too much time on that. But so the question is about what is the role of social housing. So Tom's just talked about the benefit cost ratio, but if we think about it a bit more contextually, what's the role of social housing? It's important because it can improve social inclusion, it can improve participation. It also contributes to placemaking and to economic productivity in terms of allowing people to live close to their place of work. The kind of benefits social housing gives to tenants is often linked to improvements in health and in safety, as in they have a safe and secure place to live and they don't need to worry about those kinds of things. And it also is described as giving them a sense of empowerment. And I was thinking about this just before I came in, actually, in terms of sense of empowerment. I think another really important aspect of social housing is that it also alleviates financial stress for tenants, because lots of tenants of social housing were previously homeless. And I mean, homelessness is an extreme form of financial stress. I would say it's probably not just financial stress, it's a clear sign of poverty. And then having that housing alleviates that financial stress. And through having a sense of security and also having that financial stress alleviated, it gives people options to decide what to do, how to spend their money, whether they would like to, or whether they need to buy medication or books for their children or so forth. So that's another really important role of social housing, for providing people with a sense of well-being and dignity and empowerment. For government, social housing also has several benefits, and these are really around the costs associated with savings in relation to health and justice and welfare services. And what the argument is, and that is also borne out by our data, is that people who are homeless and living in insecure housing tend to be quite high users of health and justice services, and they also are quite high users of welfare services. But once those people become housed, the rates of accessing health and justice and welfare services often drop, which then results in savings to government. And I'm going to take you through some more detail now to show you what that looked like. So as part of our research, as Tom already said, we surveyed people who live in social housing, in particular in community housing, and we also surveyed people who were experiencing homelessness. And in both instances, we looked at people who had been homeless for some time. So the people who we targeted who were living in social housing were people who had previously been homeless for at least a period of up to 2 years or had experienced 3 spells of homelessness in the preceding 2 years before they managed to access community housing. And the people who were homeless we spoke to, or we didn't actually personally speak to thanks to COVID, but who we surveyed with the help of caseworkers were people who had been experiencing chronic homelessness for at least 2 years or had had several long-term spells of homelessness in the previous 2 years. We did that to make sure that we had matching groups when we did a comparison between the two. So what did we find out from these surveys? One of the key things is that that the kind of responses that are provided by the homelessness system in the ACT and Australia more widely are often centred around providing crisis and temporary housing, but that those kind of responses don't really work that well for some homeless people, and that they're also very expensive to provide, and that relying on crisis and temporary housing can actually contribute to housing instability and worsen people's situation rather than improving it. So really characteristic of that was that people experienced a lack of pathways to long-term housing. So even when they accessed help for their situation, there were very few pathways into long-term housing. Some people, especially people with complex needs, they tended to cycle into and out of the system many times. And it's not really just a cycle as in a circle, where people come in and out and in and out. I think each time, what the research shows is that each time somebody enters into the system and drops out again, often their resources get further and further eroded. So it's a bit like a downward spiral rather than a cycle that goes round and round. And these people also often tend to be high users of justice and health services. We found that some people are stuck in temporary housing for long periods of time. That really undermines their sense of security and stability. It's also expensive to provide that temporary housing to them. And the frequent moves that are associated with people staying in that temporary housing, that undermines their security. It also undermines their ability to access employment, to send their children to stable schooling, and so forth. Many people who experience long-term homelessness and housing instability, they rely on financial assistance, and that can be quite a broad range, ranging from assistance with rental bonds, no-interest loans. Many accessed emergency payments and also food assistance. Next Tom. So I just thought, rather than speaking in the abstract, I'll give you an example of what it actually looks like. So we did several case studies, and they're all included in the report if you would like to read them. But here's an example of a homeless person who participated in our research. Her name is Talia, not her real name. We've obviously changed the names and changed some of the details to protect people's anonymity. But Talia is a young woman, and she has 6 children, and they're all under the age of 15. She had experienced a difficult situation and is separated from her husband. She comes from a culturally diverse background, and she doesn't speak English very well. So Talia receives a parenting payment, and she's currently looking for work, but because of her parenting responsibilities and her lack of educational qualifications and her language barriers, it's very hard for her to find work. It's also hard for her to find accommodation. The kind of houses that she would need for a large family are scarce, and where they are available, they're also unaffordable. Talia and her children have been living in temporary and or crisis accommodation for 2 years and 8 months now. Talia is experiencing financial stress, and in the past 12 months, she's struggled to pay for utilities and has also applied for a no-interest loan. Talia is currently being supported with case management and counselling in relation to domestic and family violence-related issues. This has included providing her with emergency overnight accommodation in a domestic and family violence shelter, and with assistance to access public or community housing to achieve longer-term accommodation, but that's not been successful as yet. Talia has been in contact with the courts and with the police twice in the past 12 months in relation to assault-related issues, and she was also once stopped by the police in a vehicle. Talia thinks or considers herself to be in good physical and mental health, and she's visited a GP several times in the past 12 months. And she's also had one overnight stay in a public hospital. So this sort of gives a bit of a picture of what Talia's life and situation is like at the moment. And for this particular study, we also tried to calculate the costs that are associated with Talia's situation. And so if we're looking at the cost over a period of 1 year, you can see that the costs are relatively high at over $80,000, which is comprised of the kind of costs associated with her health usage, the justice costs, and particularly high the kind of welfare costs associated with her situation. So in that last dot point at the bottom there, we compare this with other women who were in our study who were in community housing, and you can see that there's a lower cost of $67,000 around about there associated with them being in community housing. So it's really interesting or also important to keep in mind that each person's story is different, and the costs associated with the people who participate in our study vary very widely from rather low to rather high. So I'm giving you a case study here of Trace, who's at the higher end of cost. And Trace, he's a young man, he's a young Aboriginal man, and he's experiencing mental health and AOD issues. He's single and he has no children. He's completed TAFE, but he's not currently working or studying. Trace is experiencing financial stress and he's currently on New Start, but in the last 12 months, he's also received the disability support pension for 6 weeks. And in the last 12 months, he's also needed help with financial and material aid, including food help. For the past 2 weeks before completing the survey that we asked him to complete, Trace had managed to find accommodation in a crisis housing for young people. But his journey through housing in the entire year preceding the study was quite unsettled. He had long spells of housing insecurity and homelessness. He rented in the private market for a period of 3 months, but then he got behind in the rent and was evicted. He then stayed in transitional housing for a period of 3 months and in various forms of crisis accommodation. He was couch surfing with friends and family and also was rough sleeping for a period of time. This was a very unsettled period for Trace, and during this time he accessed assistance to get short-term crisis housing 4 times and accessed help to get long-term housing once. Trace has also been diagnosed with a mental health condition, and there were times during the past 12 months when he really needed assistance for this, but he wasn't able to access help. In the past 12 months, he spent 2 weeks in an adult mental health unit and has received case management services for mental health support, disability services, justice services, and outreach support. In the past 12 months, Trace has had over 100 engagements with GPs, medical specialists, nurses, and allied health practitioners, public hospitals, and outpatient clinics. He was on a CTO, which is a CTO for some time during the past 12 months, but this is no longer current. Trace is also receiving help for his AOD issues and has about 14 contacts for this in the past 12 months. He's also experienced being stopped by the police several times and has spent about 10 nights in prison, 7 days on remand over the past year. Trace estimates that he's had around 200 contacts with the Justice Office in the past year, and he's also been a victim of domestic and family violence. So you can see that this has been a really unsettled period for Trace, and that's also reflected in the kind of costs that are associated with this experience.
A bit louder.
Okay, Tom says I need to speak louder, yes, and that's also reflected in the kind of costs that have been associated with this experience, which we calculated to be around $213,000 per year. A large component of that are the health costs associated with this experience and also the justice costs, and the welfare costs are somewhat lower. When we compared this to the average cost for a person, a housed young male who was comparable in age and background to Trace, the costs for those people were only about $133,000. And we also compared this to 3 other young people who were in community housing, had less costs again at around $68,000 per year. Okay, so then the question is, how much does it actually cost to provide social housing? So in order to do that, we first tried to ascertain how much does it actually cost the ACT government to provide social housing. And we discovered from analysis data from the report on government services, which estimates that in 2019-2020, the overall cost to the ACT government of providing public housing was around $55,300 per per dwelling, per public housing dwelling. The cost to the ACT government for providing community housing was only around $8,400 per tenant per unit per year. So that doesn't reflect the overall cost of providing community housing, but it's the cost to government of that community housing. So the investment in community housing by the ACT government is considerably less than the investment in public housing. When we compared the overall cost of operating community housing, and this is based on data that we collected from community housing providers, we managed to arrive at an estimate of around $47,000 per dwelling per year. So that's the cost of operating existing community housing. We were then also interested in trying to ascertain how much does it cost to develop new community housing in the ACT. So in order to do that analysis, we drew on data that we collected, quite detailed financial data that we managed to get from two community housing providers who participated in our study. And in that table that you can see there in the top line, we compare that to the cost of public and community housing as estimated by Zaretsky and Flatter in 2015. So that data is actually from 2013, so it's not quite the newest, but I think Jim has indexed that to CPI, so it is comparable to today's dollars. So what we found there, you can see that there are two different values because the developers provided two different estimates for different types of dwelling, and also the cost of developing new community housing is really variable. It depends on the land costs, the kind of rents charged, the size and type of housing that's being built, and the available of government subsidy from other sources. Nevertheless, we found that there is a funding gap in each instance, but that funding gap varies obviously on the type of housing built and also on the kind of subsidies that are available. So if we restrict ourselves to only the kind of revenues that a community housing provider would get from rental income and interest revenue, the funding gap in one instance is around $27,000, and in the other instance, it's more expensive, around $51,000. However, one of the developers still had built this housing, and while the NRAS scheme was still in operation, and those federal subsidies from NRAS brought the funding gap down to $19,200. So you can see from that table, so the overall cost, the capital cost of providing that housing, it costs community housing providers, plus the average costs in terms of user cost of capital and depreciation. And then we added that together for the total cost of dwelling per year and deducted from that the kind of interest and revenues to arrive at the funding gap. So what we see here is that in any case, there is a funding gap. And interestingly too, one of the developers, in order to fund this development, sold 86% of the newly developed housing either as affordable home ownership housing or as market price housing in order to cross-subsidise the housing that was the smaller proportion of housing that was retained to provide social and affordable rental housing. Okay. So that was just the cost of housing and the offsets in terms of the housing costs, but there are other benefits that can be calculated also in financial terms that provide benefits to government. And we discovered that providing more long-term social housing in the ACT can result in significant cost savings to government. And so in order to do that, we calculated the cost offsets that resulted from people being stably housed in terms of their changed or largely reduced use of health, justice and welfare services. And we found that, I nearly said on average, but as a median, tenants in community housing use approximately $28,700 in various services. And as a median period, people who experience homelessness, you can see the quantum is much higher, use about $44,000 per annum in services. And so then if you calculate the difference, it's a savings to government from housing people of around $15,300 per person per year. And again, I want to point out that these are the median figures. And as you've seen previously with the case studies, some people are quite high users of services, some people are lesser users of services. So the actual benefit per person varies quite a lot, which is why we've opted for the median figure. And because the number of people who were involved in our study was relatively small, the ACT being quite a small territory, we were quite interested in finding out whether our findings were consistent with studies from the literature. So we really went to all the Australian literature that we could get our hands on that had done kind of assessments of cost offset methodology, and we found that the figures that we arrived at were comparable with the figures that came out in other studies. So we're quite confident in saying that they're reasonably reliable. And based on these figures then, here I've spelled out what the difference is. Yeah, so the difference in service use can range from $32,800 to $213,000. And I really want to point out there also that people who are homeless who are low service users doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need those services. It just means that they don't actually access those services whether or not they need them. So then if we put all of this together and we calculate the effective recurrent costs per dwelling per year of new community housing, net of the kind of cost offset in the ACT, we find that if we use the low cost model, the cost of new housing is around $39,500. And when we calculate the costs net of revenues and offset, it's $11,600, which gives us a cost benefit ratio, or rather benefit cost ratio of 57 cents to each dollar's invested. And if we look at the high cost model, you will see there that it comes out at a benefit cost ratio of 29 cents for each dollar invested. So there are definite cost savings associated with providing more social housing in the ACT, and I think that makes quite a strong case for building new housing and funding that funding gap.
Great. Thank you, Travis. We'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Tom. We'll now have a kind of a Q&A, which I'll do my best to facilitate, both in the room, and I'll follow any questions that people online want to submit in the chat. But before I do that, I'm just conscious that we have online Wendy Hayhurst, who is the CEO of the Community Housing Industry Association at a national level, who I have the pleasure of working with in my role on National Shelter Council. And Wendy has significant expertise in her current role and previous role at New South Wales and with housing associations in the UK. I'm not tech savvy enough to do this, but if Wendy wants to share any insights and can be brought in online, that would be great.
Thank you, first of all. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm on Gadigal land, the land of the AHURI Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank Travis for his invitation to this event. And also thank AHURI for that presentation. It's a subject very close to my heart, Nicola, and in fact we've been doing some work along the same lines, slightly different. And I wouldn't mind, first of all, Travis, opening the questions a little bit here, because I think it's a really interesting piece of work, and the way that you've put that together. But one thing's, and there's no but about it really, but one thing I was thinking as you're talking about it is just how complex it is trying to assess the value of social housing. You know, I'm an old housing officer, as Travis has sort of pointed out. I spent a long time on the front line in the UK, spent, you know, getting on for 35, 36 years working in various bits of housing. And I knew intuitively that this is great. And when we start to try and demonstrate through social return investment, we're really restricted, I think, to those sorts of outcomes which we can put a dollar price on. And when I was looking at your social return investment, I was thinking, so what about this? So what about the standard of housing that we provide and the environmental benefits that might come from improving energy efficiency, reducing fuel poverty, enabling people to heat their homes in Canberra during the winter and ventilate them well during the summer? There's all of those benefits that might come as well. And then I was thinking, if we're providing housing to people who have been living in expensive private rental accommodation? Are there other benefits that come because they no longer have to devote so much time and so much effort into paying the rent, that they can go out and enjoy Canberra's other attractions and spend money in small local business? Or is there sort of multiplier effects that come from providing people with cheaper rents? And then, it's great that you've done those case studies, but I think we also need to look at what happens, thinking about the first case study, the woman with all those children. What benefits might accrue to those children from living in stable accommodation that doesn't cost very much? So, is it possible to build in here the potential benefits that come from having a stable environment, doing better at school, getting a better job? So, Travis, my question to AHURI after that long introduction is, do you think that piece of work, great as it is, and demonstrating the benefit to ACT government here of investing, could we make it even more compelling over the next wee while?
Yeah. Thanks, Wendy. I really appreciate you raising that. It was something that we grappled with and discussed here, and ultimately, decided to. Oh, hi, Wendy.
I found it.
Yeah. Good to see you
now. And really sort of grappled with, and so as I'm sure you're aware, we skated a bit over these issues in the first report, but we do when we discuss there the benefit of housing and in the evidence summary, really drawing largely on AHURI evidence, but elsewhere as well. We do identify a whole range of benefits of housing, which obviously go far beyond simply avoiding costs to government, but even putting them in economic terms. I mean, just the potential for greater economic participation, which you've raised very clearly, and the greater release, if you like, of human capital into society is something there that we were aware of and that we talked about briefly in that first report. But at the end of the day, and you're quite right, and it is a but. I think what we came down to was saying, well, what we really have the time and the resources to do right now, and is to focus on that effectively cost avoidance model. Is what it is. It's about flagging, identifying costs that are incurred because people are not housed or inadequately housed, and then putting a price to that and identifying, well, housing people, subsidising people's housing is an expensive thing to do, but the actual upfront cost is not the whole picture. There is downstream significant saving as well, and that's really what we've tried to map out here.
Yeah, I think so. But I think when that point that you were making about, especially the mother with the children, about having stable housing for children is a really, really important one. And I haven't really seen that costed yet, but that's a brilliant idea because, I mean, we know that a large chunk of our homeless population is children and young people. I don't know the exact figures, but I think it's almost a quarter of homeless people are children and young people. And we also know that of those people who experience chronic homelessness, quite a lot of those had their first experience of homelessness as a child or a young person. So these intergenerational effects of having unstable housing as a young person are quite strong. And I think it's definitely worthwhile to think about how that could be costed and how that could be factored in, because I think in terms of demonstrating to government the benefits, it's really quite a long way down the track, but there are definite flow-on savings coming from that. So yeah, thanks for suggesting that actually. So I'll put that in my memory bank.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks, Tom and Nicola. Before I open it up broadly to questions, I just wondered, we do have, staying the national perspective, we also have Francis Crimmins in the room, who is the Homelessness Australia rep for the ACT, and I'm really pleased to see HAQ keeping on, as I was the policy wonk there for the better part of the 5 years, a little while back. So I just wondered if Francis had any national insights from Homelessness Australia's perspectives.
Thanks so much, Travis. And yes, as Travis has alluded, we have been running in a volunteer capacity at Homelessness Australia since defunding at a national level. However, we have persevered and we do continue to share and collaborate. And these findings supports anecdotally what we share every 2 months around Australia as we give updates around Australia, and that this data, as AHURI have found out, is supported in the same data coming out from the other states and territories. So Homelessness Australia has put in a national call and will continue to call on the federal government for a significant investment into social housing. We have been pushing for social housing to be considered infrastructure, and we will continue pushing that policy piece. But I say that with also our evidence-based work on housing first. And this is a term that is thrown around in lots of organisations around in Australia and around the country. With our meagre resources, we've invested a lot of time in developing the standards and principles of housing first that must be applied to all social housing. We've got a brand new website, and you can find those principles on that website, and they are the standards that we're saying need to be achieved and maintained across the country. We'll be providing training for people in housing first, and there is a train the trainer model available now. So we are pushing, as I said, for social housing investment from the federal government. We have to stop this pushing it from as a state territory responsibility, and the federal government then states and territories push back up. We're obviously looking forward to seeing what the outcomes will be in Victoria from that government's commitment, and also the still significant investment in Queensland. But waiting for further investments from other states and territories. So that's where I'm with that.
Thanks, Francis. I'm conscious that we have people with significantly greater expertise in actually achieving outcomes for people in housing and service delivery in the room. And we have Andrew Hannon and Andrew Rowe, who I think are the providers that use AHURI's affordable housing assessment tool, which fed into the cost-benefit analysis for this work. So I'll just open it up to people who may want to share insights or ask any questions now.
Thanks, Travis. It's really appreciate this research, and very happy to be play a small part in it. One of the reasons I wanted to get something like this done is absolutely passionate about the role of research, the formulation of policy, and understanding the problems we face and the best ways to resolve that. So it was good to be able to get this off the ground. And I remember initial conversations with Travis. I thought, this is so important, and it hasn't been done, that I'm willing to fund it from Public House to as much as possible. So I was really, really pleased and somewhat relieved when my colleagues across the sector said, yeah, this is important too, and we'll chip in. So it was certainly a collaborative effort in all sorts of ways. Like most good research, it opens up lots more questions. And there's a couple of areas in the report that I think are worth unpacking, and perhaps a little bit ways of doing that. I was pleased to see that there was some detail on the differences between the economic benefits of public housing and community housing. That's really pleasing to see that in stark figures. There is an important role for both public housing and community housing in the social housing set. We do different things well, and I think we serve different communities well. One area I don't agree with totally is that of the very low income and those with high and complex support needs. In Havelock House down the road here, the community who lives there in that congregate setting is generally a high and complex support needs person. And one of the reasons we do so well there and we have such a high impact is that very assertive overlay of individual social supports, community development support, and the really hard work that we put in to reconnect people with their communities, to scaffold the rebuilding of their lives and open up pathways to other housing, more suitable housing, jobs, and being engaged and active citizen. And that's one area where community housing providers do really, really well. And I think that it's often not thought about as much as it should. I've joined in a few political roundtables recently through the Chamber of Commerce. And one of those, there was a lot of excited discussion, about 40 minutes, I sat there and listened about the future of Canberra and economic development and economic growth. And this particular discussion was around the space industry. And that was a bit of a surprise to me. Little boy, you looked at the heavens and that's pretty exciting. Oh, okay, I didn't know it was quite a thing at the moment. And Canberra is apparently well positioned to participate in that. And I listened to this for about 40 minutes, and I listened to various people representing industry saying some of the challenges they face, but also the opportunities. And then there was a bit of a found a break. I thought, yes, but if all of those bright young things, the researchers, the people who serve these industries, the lower paid occupations, if they can't afford to come to Canberra to live, and they can go to Adelaide, there's another city that's trying to enter this industry, they can go and live there and have a better life, a higher quality of life, and they can afford a house. What are we going to do? That's going to scupper our whole vision for what Canberra can do in our economic growth. Housing is so important, and it's such a dire problem here, and I don't think it's being addressed as well as it can be, or as urgently as it can be. And it is so intrinsic to the future of this beautiful city, what we can do, and the quality of life to our communities. So thanks to the research team, thanks to Travis and Lydia. That wasn't a question, but
thanks, Andrew. And anyone else who would like to know? Where am I going?
Sorry, Claire Hall. I think this is really useful information in our report, and it's really good to have some ACT-based stuff. I do have a fairly major concern about the way the term benefit-cost relationship has been used in this report, because it's used in a different context in other reports. And if you give to your Treasury Department or your Department of Finance anything that comes out as a benefit-cost ratio of less than 1, they can just pull it out. So I think the way the terms are used is, I mean, I'm not suggesting that the information that has to get into it is accurate, but I think there's another question that has to be considered. I might go back to, and I'll forget one of my company I used to work with, one of my past lives. Dr. Marcus still did some work on the benefit-cost ratio of expenditure on public housing and came up with a figure of around 7. As in, for every dollar you spend, you get $7 of benefit. So we've got some really different ways of using information that we feed into this equation. So I think we've just got to be really careful about the way we use that terminology. I might also say I think some of the information that's been taken out of the Productivity Commission report in relation to community housing probably doesn't pick up some of the fine nuances of the differences of the way that between the ACT and some of the other states and territories. So the terms of community and social housing also used in different contexts.
Thanks, Claire. I don't know whether the researchers have any comment on that, or whether you want me to go to another question, but I do think that it is a very rich and complex set of data, and so you can imagine the fun I had this morning trying to distill it into 2.5 column inches for the Canberra Times. So, yeah, I just did Tom or Nicola, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, just well, mainly that we're struggling a bit to hear what people are saying through the microphone. I must, so I caught most of what Andrew said, but unfortunately we missed what Francis said before, and then that last question I only sort of caught intermittently. Are you able, Travis, to sort of summarise the key point there?
Yeah. bring that over.
I picked up there was something around the cost benefit analysis, but I didn't
just
pick up much else. Sorry.
No, I just know that there's some concerns, but we couldn't really hear what they were because the audio is really poor.
I might do my best to summarise Claire's points around just the different ways of measuring cost-benefit analysis. And so there's the economic return on investment that I think modelling for the Sharp proposal and modelling from the nation-building stimulus investment that was done in response to the GFC a decade and a bit ago, that showed sort of $7 returned for every $1 invested in well-located social housing, and the kind of different cost-benefit ratio in this research. Are you able to talk a little bit about the differences in how the social and economic return is measured in different contexts?
A little bit, and in very broad terms. And we know from other projects that we work on that there is obviously a range of ways that these sorts of calculations can be done. There's different models, and obviously what comes out at the end of the day is very much dependent on what assumptions are made at the start of any type of cost-benefit analysis. What we've done is not strictly a cost-benefit analysis, which is a very particular type of analysis. We've arrived at a benefit-cost ratio, but using the methodology that is outlined, I think, very clearly in the report itself. Something like that $7 return. I'm not super familiar with that report, but I know of that. I know that report, but I don't. I'm not super familiar with their methodology. But having, I guess, contributed to the development of assumptions in other instances where those sorts of figures have been arrived at, there's a lot that gets built into a number like that, a lot of inputs based on a whole range of assumptions, and without sort of knowing specifically what they are, it's not sort of possible for me to comment on that. I mean, I guess what is important, what we've done here is to be very transparent and explicit about assumptions that we've made and where we've got our figures from, whether that's through the primary research that we've conducted through surveying people in the ACT, or whether that's been derived from previously published figures.
Thanks, Tom. And I guess with the ongoing economic uncertainty that we find ourselves in as we transition towards higher rates of vaccination and other things that modelling this week tells us will bring us back economically from where we've been in the last 12 months. I guess social housing has certainly been demonstrated in other research to be a really, really good thing to invest in counter-cyclical economic times. And so I think as you've said, Tom, the research points to the potential benefit of maybe doing a larger scale similar study or having the ACT government investigate kind of the economic and social return for the territory of investing in really changing the life outcomes of people by housing them securely in social and affordable housing. And one of the things that I haven't said, that with your indulgence I would say, social and affordable housing delivers two things that the private rental market in this town currently does not. And one of those is affordability for the person living in the property. But crucially, I've been a private tenant for too many years, and I can say that security of tenure is paramount for tenants. And surveys back that up. And so social and affordable housing delivers two critical social returns to the individual in that it is affordable for the tenant and it enables them to have enough money to meet the costs of health and welfare and heating their homes and participate socially. But it also crucially delivers that security of tenure that we don't really see in the private rental market, where the average length of stay in any one property in the ACT is about 18 months. So it really shows you that in private rental, those housing outcomes are quite short term. And I'm sure there's an economic and social return to the individuals and to the territory from people not needing to move house as often, because we know even financially alone, the cost of moving house is significant. So just see who else has any questions or comments now.
No, it's all good.
Trying to solve this issue privately, because I think the social housing problem is massive. I've been on the social housing list. That went after a year for the first call to go and check my first house. Second call came 3 years later. So it's a massive issue. But seeing those figures, $55,000 per year or $46,000 per year, don't you think that could be spent more wisely, in the sense that my rent is way less? Everyone's mortgage is probably less than that. Is there a better way of addressing this issue? Has anyone thought of that, or are we just going with the 70s problem solving?
Anyone have any thoughts or a response to all these questions?
Travis, again, we can't hear you.
We didn't catch the whole question.
We can't hear the question.
If you're able to,
Are you able to just read
The question was, Nicola and Tom, for your benefit, was around the 55,000 or the 46,000 annual recurrent cost per tenant in social housing dependent on the landlord, and is that a higher cost than perhaps just paying somebody's rent, or if they can get over the deposit gap, helping them to service their mortgage, or what are the kinds of input costs and recurrent costs and things that go into those figures?
Yeah, I mean that's that particular figure, the 55,000 odd dollars that we've mentioned, relates specifically to public housing, and that includes not just the actual money spent in the year. It includes the user cost of capital and also the recurrent associated costs, as in, it factors in the pricing of
but also,
staff working in the department
and the tenancy management and the kind of things that go around that. But I think the other thing to keep in mind that there are different kinds of groups of people who live in public housing who have different kinds of needs to the people who live in community housing who have different kinds of needs to the people who can rent in the private rental market. And so, of course, there are different ways of allocating that money, but I think for the particular cohort who needs to live in public housing because there are particular circumstances, I think, and we've done a lot of research around that, and even just recently in the various departments, the options for people to move out of public housing into alternate types of housing are extremely limited, and it's not just because of the lack of availability of those tenures, and there is a lack of availability of those tenures, but it is also because of the kind of supports and the kind of things that people who live in public housing need. And that's unfortunately got to do with the fact that public housing is very scarce and has been rationed quite a lot. So the kind of people who are eligible at this point in time to actually get into public housing often have very complicated lives, very complex support needs, and for them it is often just not realistic to move into other tenures, at least not in the short term. So what's my argument then? My argument is there's a definite place for public housing and there's a definite place for social and community housing. And so that money is not, that figure there is not, yes, we also need investment in other types of housing, but that money is definitely needed to continue to maintain public housing and it reflects some of the complexities of providing it.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or insights that they'd like to share with us?
Thank you. Well, thanks for your remarks earlier, Travis, about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander needs for social housing. And when I look through your report, I see one part there. So the homelessness services are well used by Aboriginal peoples, and we need to do more about that. When I listened to the Prime Minister this morning about closing the gap, there wasn't a lot of mention about social housing at all. I'm part of the Sector Strengthening Housing Working Group for the closing the gap, and we were putting the pressure on, but I think the Commonwealth likes to fish it out to the states. We're trying to say, no, it's your responsibility also. So any support, and I think I'm making contact with the AHURI later on to do some work around the same for Aboriginal housing. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Is there any response to that from the research team, or does anyone have anything else to
And we could hear that question or that comment really clearly, so that was great. Look, just only to, I guess, say, look, we understand, and it's for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, very significantly overrepresented amongst those figures for housing need that we show. So completely.
Yeah, so that research is really, really important research, and it definitely should be done.
Yeah, and I guess one other issue that pops up for me, and I don't know how you would test it, but I'm confident there is significant discrimination experienced in the housing market in Canberra and everywhere else by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when they apply for private rental properties, especially in a city where property managers can passively discriminate in favour of people with two incomes because the vacancy rate is so low. And demand is so high. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah. While you're looking around there, Travis, I'll just sort of comment on what you just said there in relation to the previous person's question, which we didn't hear so well, but I think there was a distinction being made there between what we talk about as, I guess, direct supply of housing versus a demand side subsidy. And I think that sort of reinforces the point, the subsequent comment that you made about discrimination, reinforces that point that how important direct supply is, and how a demand side subsidy based approach can fail to overcome some of those types of issues like discrimination in the marketplace.
We now have Minister Basrotti who'd like to share some insights. She did send a video message, but I've been instructed not to play that, so we won't, and we'll hear from the Minister now.
Thanks very much, Travis, and thank you. Yeah, I have to leave because we've got question time that I get in trouble if I don't turn up to. So we did do a little video, but we sort of hadn't been at the presentation, so it's not worth listening to. Look, thanks very much. I've been asked to make some concluding comments, and I will note that I am making the comments on the beautiful land of the Ngunnawal people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and really recognise the disproportionate impact of housing stress and discrimination for our First Nations people, and sort of the work that we need to do in relation to that. And I'd also just like to put my apologies in. unfortunately, my ministerial colleague, Minister Berry, wasn't able to make it, but was really interested in attending and had staff that's here furiously taking notes. And so we were just asked to make a few sort of concluding comments, and I don't want to stop the conversation, so please feel free to keep making the comments, but I just thought it was worth doing that before I scuttle off. But I just would really like to thank both the sponsoring partners and the researchers for this really, really useful and important piece of work. I think, you know, independent research that really aims to dig into the issues and present some of the evidence is really important and really complementary to the work that is happening in ACT government. I think it is really helpful for us in terms of the arguments that we need to make to our colleagues and to Treasury. So I think, you know, sort of picking up on the comments of Claire, sort of making, you know, arming us with information that will assist us in the conversations that we have, I think is really important. I think that, you know, as we do know, but is really highlighted in this research, that the scale of the issue is really immense, and it is something that that when I look at the figures and look at what we need to do, it is something that we do need to do in collaboration. This isn't something that government can solve on their own, and certainly not something that ACT government can fully do on their own. We really need our partner organisations to be working with us. You know, I think it is important that the advocacy that you do at a national level in terms of the role of the federal government is actually really important. I think that one of the headline figures in terms of we are comparative to other parts of Australia, I think that, you know, this is an issue that's being faced across jurisdictions, both in Australia and in the world, and just things that are going on at the moment that just don't make any sense in terms of the pressure of the housing market across the board, that we're seeing increases in prices that's just making our job so much more difficult. It doesn't help anyone that our houses are being valued at the way that they are, and when we are really making significant commitments in renewing and expanding public housing, we are, you know, while we do have some levers, we are operating in this market as well, and we know that the issues on materials and trades as well is making this very, very difficult. I certainly see that there is a significant role to play for community organisations. It is a complementary role. This isn't something about competition. There's such a big job to do that we actually need to look at a range of things. I really take the point in terms of trying to solve a problem in a 70s way. This group is a group of people that are really clever, and so I think we actually do need to be creative and innovative and work out how we do this, because even if we had, you know, the financial resources, we wouldn't be able to deliver, you know, some of this. So we really do need to work creatively. So thank you very much. I will be taking the reports home. I'm really looking forward to the ongoing conversations that we have in relation to this, and we will continue to try and solve this very wicked problem.
Thank you, Minister, and that's a good point that you make, because I've said to our colleagues at Housing ACT that we also hope that this research is a useful tool for their own budget bids and to make the case to Treasury for more investment and cash and in-kind contributions through the land release program and other measures going forward. Andrew?
One of the factors leading to this research was talking to Travis about what the response was from policymakers when we were comparing with other jurisdictions in the research. It was, well, that doesn't apply in the ACT, that applies to that jurisdiction, different policy here. So, okay, well, let's do some research on the policy that's relevant to the policy environment here. I wondered if the researchers could comment on the differences between the ACT and other jurisdictions, and what other jurisdictions are doing well, perhaps, compared to us, and what we might, what sort of examples we might follow to improve the situation in the ACT.
Thanks, Andrew.
We'll attempt to do that fairly properly if we can. I think one of the big differences, or the biggest one I think that I'm aware of from the point of view of your sector, Andrew, is actually the land ownership model in the ACT being quite a different one fundamentally, and that is that has some, I guess, challenges for some community housing providers, but I think it also has historically in Canberra been a big source of some opportunity in terms of how housing was provided over time, and the fact that the public housing stock was able to be built up quite well, quite early. But I guess a significant difference, if a relatively minor one, but one that's significant for particular organisations, has been the say for example in Sydney, a group like a church-based organisation, for example, that might have significant land holding, might then use that land holding to generate housing. There's I guess barriers to organisations doing that in the ACT that we became aware of through this process. That was one thing, but otherwise, I mean, I think the main, as we said in the presentation, one of the main takeaway findings was actually just how similar the actual extent of need was in the ACT, and that ultimately the kind of the benefit cost ratio we came up with was comparable to other jurisdictions as well. I noticed on my screen here that Wendy was wanting to contribute something to this. I'm not sure if that's feasible. So.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. My microphone is controlled, so I just have to be patient. Thanks. Just to answer that question, or to give an idea, Andrew. I wish I could tell you about England and Scotland, but it's so far away, and the policy environment is very different. But just coming back to Sydney, I do wonder. You have a form of inclusion rezoning in ACT, but I believe it's targeted at affordable home ownership, and that's laudable. But if I'm thinking of the centre of Sydney, and probably one of the more successful uses of planning concessions in Australia is a provider and City of Sydney, and using the inclusion rezoning dollars to subsidise the provision of affordable housing. So developers have to provide the cash value of 3% of the site that they're developing. A bit more complicated than that, but that's essentially it. That goes into a fund. It accumulates, particularly in an area where there's plenty of development. And after all, Canberra, there is plenty of development. That cash amount then can be used by the community housing provider to subsidise the creation of social and affordable housing. And it seems to me that that would be something the ACT government could do pretty easily. And the report provides them with the evidence of what the benefits will be there. So that would be my contribution, Andrew.
Yeah, it's great when we support that as well. Mm.
Thank you, Wendy. And I think at the moment we've got territory plan review consultations up and running with a series of discussion papers. So putting on the table inclusionary zoning and inclusionary housing and other things that we might be able to do in terms of planning instruments and embedding incentives in the planning system is something I'd be keen to pursue with EPSDD and SEMTED and others. Because I think there is interest in some of the from some of the developers I've spoken to through our engagement with the Property Council and others in looking at what kinds of bonuses and incentives, whether they be density bonuses or the sorts of arrangement that Wendy was talking about that in Sydney, there is interest in what the property industry can do. So hopefully the findings from these reports adds weight to the case for doing that. So we are about 10 minutes from when we said we'd finish, but I'll just see if anyone else has anything else they'd like to contribute. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. And look, well done to the research team. CHC was very happy to be a co-sponsor of the body of work that was completed, and I think it's a really good body of work. And it certainly has promoted discussion, and in our sector, and in terms of the need that is there, anything that promotes discussion is very useful. The one thing I just wanted to mention was that there was talk before about, like a 1970s approach to trying to deal with the problem. Through the Community Housing Industry Association, which I'm the chair nationally and also chair things here locally, we have put in a budget submission for the ACT government budget process. We've got 7 policy positions, which are pragmatic, in our mind, affordable steps that government could take to deliver on their stated commitments around growth in social and affordable rental supply. We're in the middle of engaging various government bureaucrats and ministers and ministerial officers on that, but it's all publicly available through the budget consultation website. It does pick up on some of the inclusionary zoning aspects. It picks up on from the research report that we've all got in front of us, things like discounted land, co-contributions, so equity contribution by government, and a range of other very pragmatic steps that the net cost to government and the submission focuses primarily on affordable rental. In terms of the overlay with the report you've all got, the affordable rental piece is really income quintile 2 and probably the bottom end of income quintile 3. So it's a slightly different cohort. But I guess the headline figure is that our position as the Community Housing Industry Association, or the ACT members, comprising 11 members, is that the cost of the problem is about $60 to $90 million for the ACT government to deliver 600 affordable rentals over the next 4.5 years. The final point I would make is that that's over that time, so it's what, 12 to 15 mil a year or thereabouts. The final point I would make is that there's no expectation in any of this, and I think Minister Vasaroti appropriately sort of made this comment too. And this is not just a cost to government. There is a community housing sector that's ready, willing and able to co-invest alongside government. And with the right government policy settings, it can also attract institutional capital. And indeed, that's what's happening in other jurisdictions. We're actively working on that as a sector here in this space, actively engaging ACT government on those things. But it's not. This is all not just a problem for government to solve. It's a collective problem for us all to solve as a community. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone else have any final insights they want to share? If not, I might just conclude by again thanking all of the organisations that co-funded this work and thanking the organisations who found people for the surveys, and thanking the AHURI research team for what we intend to use as an ongoing advocacy and lobbying tool, because ultimately, while there's a lot of dry economic data, there's a lot of costings in there. There's talk about input costs and cost benefit analyses and costs to portfolio X. we ultimately need to see the findings from these reports translate into meaningful changes to the life outcomes of Canberrans who are doing it pretty bloody hard in a rental market that priced a lot of people out a long time ago, and who are doing it really hard if their only option between now and October is a little hatchback on Mount Ainslie or finding a place in between a shop front, or if they're moving between institutional settings and crisis care because they don't have any housing options in this territory. So ultimately, we will use this research and the findings from it to press for a significant uplift in investment in the affordable, secure homes that we know will make a significant difference, not just to people now, but as we heard earlier, the children of people in housing crisis and experiencing homelessness now. I think affordable and social housing investment is critical if we are to make a material difference to breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty. And I think that the return on that investment won't be able to be celebrated by governments that are in now, and that's tricky, getting beyond the 3-year cycle. But we hope that this research and the findings from it has some longevity to press for really meaningful investment that changes the lives of Canberrans who really need it most. So thanks, everyone.